I'd like to first of all start by thanking everyone, all the organisers, this marvellous Niger Delta Peace Initiative, Anna, and of course Juliet Macapila, who invited me, who's this wonder woman of community and transformational change, a very inspiring figure for me personally. So I'm delighted to be here today. Now, I think Martin's given a wonderful preview, because I was going to start by explaining myself. So maybe we could go straight on to the next slide and I'll say what I'm going to talk about today, if you don't mind. Okay, so quick introduction. Martin has done a lot of that. And then I'm planning before the gap to talk about the disparities. What are they? And then to remember the other gaps we have that COVID-19 has produced, and that's mental health, that's women, and there's also an issue with the space, as in physical space, not NASA and space rockets type of space. And then we'll have our gap. And then I want to move on to something I feel very strongly about, which is the opportunities, but also the problems with digital exclusion and digital poverty and, you know, a digital Africa, and a little warning about solutions to COVID-19 and the temptations of illiberalism. So Martin explained I'm a liberal Democrat campaigner, and I'm always very worried about the allure of the strong leader in a crisis. So there'll be a little bit of a talk about that. So if we can go to my next screen, if that's all clear for everybody, I'll start with my introduction. So just to tell you a little bit about me, that handsome young man there is Chuka Amuna. He was a candidate for the very important seat of Cities of London and Westminster in GE 2019. And I was what's called a canvassing team leader. So I organized, sorry, we're still, but yeah, I organized groups of volunteers and went out. It was a very difficult campaign in the winter. I don't know why we look so happy in that photo, because we lost. Maybe we could go back to that one. Do you have that photo, Martin? The slide number 2?
Yes, please. Technical, can you bring that up, please? Thank you.
We've gone back to the beginning, I think. Yes, okay. So back to that one. So very briefly, just to tell you a little bit about me. I left school when I was 17 because I was a summer baby. I did my A-levels a year early, and I went for my 1-year gap year before university. And actually, it turned out to be a 20-year gap year. So I left rural England, and I was away for 20 years. And then finally, at least 20 years, I think, yeah. I came back to London, and once you've been all over the world, it's very difficult to live anywhere other than London. And as Martin explained, I was in Israel. I went over there to do archaeology, and I went on to go to university there. And then I'm the kind of person that likes a challenge, not so much now, when I was younger. And then I thought, okay, you know, I've done this language right to left. Now let's do one that's top to bottom. And I wanted to go to China. And I couldn't get into China. The visa situation was very difficult back in those days. So I went to Japan. I went all over the Southeast Asia. And I came back to London, where I worked mostly in Japanese banks. And my area of work was, just so you know what my expertise is, if you'd like to tap into that at any time, anyone. So compliance, due diligence, and training. Now in Japan, I ran a training school for middle management. And in London, I also worked in business training and this kind of compliance for Japanese banks who were having to come under the regulations of the Bank of England. So navigating and negotiating that process. Now, fast forward, and I left the world of finance, and I decided to go into the not-for-profit section, so charity work. And I started working with asylum seekers. And I was asked to come in and help a particular group. Now, today we're talking about COVID-19, and I'm going to talk about survivors of torture. So it's all going to sound very dark, but I have to say that actually it's amazing work and amazing groups of people that I work with. So I started working with a group of survivors of torture who are also witnesses to war crimes from their countries, and we keep them safe here in England so that they can go and give testimony at The Hague to the War Crimes Tribunal. And whilst trying to keep them safe here, the outcomes for them were not great. So we decided, the founder of the charity wanted to set up something to keep them busy and decided to do training. And I discovered that when you have a group of severely traumatized people, training is very different to how you train business managers. Business managers are highly motivated. If they don't complete the course, you know, it won't look good for them at work. They want to get on. So how do you take somebody who's shell-shocked and give them the same training? Well, one of the first things I learned was to, for example, I had a student who would come in every week and would go into a corner of the room and pile up some books and things and fall asleep on the desk. So as the trainer, I'd look over, oh, he's fallen asleep. And then what we would do is we would go, shh, shh, and everybody would move away and we would let that person sleep. If it was a business manager, I think he might have been in trouble from me. But it was very important that to realize that they had found a safe space. And that's where it started. If you felt safe enough to fall asleep in the class, then there was going to be some good learning taking place. And then the next thing that I learned, so my survivors taught me more than I taught them. The next thing I learned was that the most unlikely students had the most to give. And when I let them take over and when I let the initiatives come from them, they were amazing. And they were very funny and they were creative. And the pilot scheme that we set up got massive funding, got a huge donation from Canada, and it's still continuing several years later. And we've joined in sixth form students from a local college. We've trained them to be trainers. We're running art therapy. It's really a very marvelous organization. And from that, I've gone on to set up a charity here. We have a corporate entity. And I'm in the process of setting up a charity in Singapore, which is a very difficult regulatory environment. So that is taking a little bit longer than we might expect. But anyway, any day now, I expect that to be announced. And I'm also, from the picture, a political campaigner. And as Martin said, in my free time, I'm very passionate about the environment and have set up what we call guerrilla greening. So we go out and we dig up areas on the high street around the trees, and we put flowers in. We don't ask anyone, we just do it. And then we work with the shopkeepers and they help us water them in the summer. And it's a huge benefit to everybody. And it's just a small way to help the environment. So so that's a little bit about me. So you can see where I'm coming from. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a major policy maker. I'm not a digital expert. I'm something of a technophobe. So I may not be able to answer questions in those areas, but I'm going to throw up what I think are some of the things that we need to be considering and that the diaspora will want to have a look at. So if we could have the next slide, if that's possible. Thank you. So just very quickly, this is about the two charities. So the Survivor of Torture charity is linked to the International Truth and Justice Project, and that's linked to the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And then the one in Singapore is the JB Jeyaretnam Foundation. That's in the UK, and the JB Jeyaretnam Project in Singapore. So thank you. And if we could have the next one, is Jeff, is it? Thank you. Right. So now we're going to move on to what happened, what we know about how COVID has affected people, and this is England, and how it's affected them differently. Now, I'm going to use some statistics, and I've taken those statistics from an organisation called Public Health England. So anyone can get hold of those statistics on their website. I put it at the top there, www.government.uk PHE /PHE. So all of the statistics that I'm going to talk about, and I've only put a brief few because statistics are very boring in a talk. So they don't take into account the existence of comorbidities, and those are strongly associated with the risk of death. And the majority of testing that was offered to people in hospital, so they already had a medical need. These statistics are from August 2020. And therefore, confirmed cases are not the general population who got infected. It's the people with a severe medical need already. But I think that they give us a very good snapshot at that time of what the overall situation is. And there's nothing surprising there. It's exactly what you'd expect, what we already know. So if I could have the next slide, please. Yeah. So basically what we found out about COVID is it has affected people with the same amount of disparity, the same inequality that general health outcomes. Exactly what we could have predicted. So you are more badly affected according to age, according to the area that you live in. So if you live in a deprived area, there's going to be more death from COVID. And also BAME. Now, I know some of you don't like that phrase or that acronym, but that's what the National Health in England uses. So I've used that. So this shows us that COVID-19 has completely duplicated or replicated the existing inequalities. So we have these inequalities between, if you're white and live in a wealthy area, how well you're going to do if you get sick. And comparing to the negative outcomes, if you're from the BAME community, you live in a deprived area. And COVID has replicated that. It's no different, but in many cases, it's made it worse. So there's more inequality. And it's thrown up a lot of interesting conditions and outcomes that maybe we hadn't considered before COVID. And this is where I say we're not going to get too dark, because my view is it has also thrown up some fantastic opportunities. Now, a lot of people say it was Winston Churchill, but I don't think it was Winston Churchill. I think it was Rahm Emanuel, who was President Barack Obama's advisor. And he said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, let's look at the opportunities that this gives us. And I've just put here a few details for you. So if you were 80 or older, you are 70 times more likely to die than if you're under 40. If you're a male, you're more likely to die from COVID. And it's also very impacted by geography, if you live in an urban area to if you live in a rural area. And that is slightly different across Africa, but I have the statistics here for England. Okay, so those are the inequalities. They've got worse. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so what we saw is that there's a particularly high increase amongst everybody, so cause deaths from COVID, if they were born outside the UK and Ireland. And what is particularly worrying, I think, if you were in England at the time, the first deaths that we were reading about were bus drivers. So those in a range of caring occupations. So social work, nursing and auxiliary nurses and assistants, and also drivers. So public drivers, people with passengers in road vehicles like taxi drivers, minicab drivers, chauffeurs, those working as security guards, and those kind of related occupations, those in care homes and those working in care homes. So if you look at that list of occupations, we all know that these are jobs that are low paid jobs, low income jobs often, and also often jobs that are filled by members of the BAME community. So the news about COVID outcomes has been pretty bad overall. Yeah, so I hope we're clear so far. What I'm saying is there are inequalities in society. We know about it. Surprise, surprise, same inequalities from COVID, but they got worse. And these are the very people who've been affected most. If I could have the next one then, please. So let's talk about the financial outcomes, because I know that a lot of the diaspora are sending remittances home all the time, but those on the lowest incomes were the hardest hit. But also 3 million people, it's estimated in the UK, small businesses and individuals, didn't get any kind of help from the government. They were excluded. So these were people who aren't registered as having small businesses, people who hadn't been registered in time for the tax year to get that help, and people in all kinds of self-employed, maybe renting out rooms, working at markets, little entrepreneurs and startups that just were not recognized and didn't get any help at all. So this is something I think we have to look at and think about. How can we link to the excluded community who are fighting the government very hard and campaigning to get more financial help, so that we can get financial help for the African diaspora in the UK. Now, during the pandemic, I volunteered for my local council, and it was a very low-tech solution. I'm not employed by the council. So the way that we did our work, so I'm not a social worker, so very much as a volunteer, was we were given phone numbers and lists of isolated people, because the social work system was overloaded. They simply couldn't cope. So they were asking anybody with any training or experience in that area to volunteer. And what happened is I was given phone numbers of isolated members of the community and asked to phone them once a week or twice a week. And that was very sobering. I hadn't realized how many people in my area, in my immediate area, live in complete isolation. So anything from a woman who'd had a hip operation and she was in a top floor flat and couldn't get out. So the only human being she saw was the council carer who came to her once a day. And then there were other people who only got a council carer once a week. And again, you know, if you ever get a chance to do this, do consider setting up something like this, because just a simple act of phoning around was a marvelous community enterprise, and it really did make a difference. Now, so I was shocked by the isolation, and we need to remember community and the strengths of community to come out the other side of the pandemic. Now, I've put down here, you might see I put down balconies. You might think that's a bit strange. In the past, if you lived in England or London, I think there was a have and a have-nots divided by if you had a car. And then if you had a car, whether you had off-street parking or not, you know, that was the elite, the ones that had their own off-street parking. There was a complete divide. What this pandemic has shown us, and we need to remember, it's not going to be the last pandemic, and this one isn't even finished yet. What it's shown us, for me, is that here in London and any big city, there is a complete societal divide and a disparity between those who have a bit of outside space and those that don't. And I was coming back from somewhere one day during the pandemic last summer, and there was a family sat under a tree on the pavement having a picnic because the mum didn't want to go very far away from home, and she didn't even know there was a park in the area. She didn't feel safe in the park in the area. Actually, she felt there were too many people running around. She wanted to keep her children away, and they sat on the pavement under one of the pavement trees. And she was in a top floor flat, and this is very classic in London, these tall Victorian buildings, and the ground or the basement has a garden, nobody else does, and the council doesn't allow balconies to be built. So I'm determined now to start an initiative to get the council to ease up on their objections to balconies and outside space. Some of the clients I spoke to, one gentleman had a health condition and was taking medication. The medication meant he couldn't go out in the sun. So there was a communal garden on his estate, but he couldn't go there because all the chairs were in the sun. And these were the kind of chairs that were bolted to the ground. And he was too ill to take down his own folding chair. So he couldn't get outside at all except after dark. And he wasn't very happy about that. So he never got to feel, the fresh air. And there were other people that just didn't have any balconies and nowhere for the children to play, nowhere to hang the washing. And they were all stuck at home together. And I believe, one of our speakers later is going to talk about domestic abuse, and it heavily impacts on that. So I saw that having access to some kind of outside space is something that we should start building into the blueprint for cities. And the other thing was the impact on mental health. There's no doubt that some people were pleased, that they could take a little bit of time off work. But when that became a year, that changed. Students in particular, I think, were very badly hit. They had signed up and paid and taken loans for courses that they then couldn't attend. They'd gone into student housing, rented flats. The university closed down and they struggled. They couldn't get those part-time jobs that allowed them to continue studying. So they were a sector that were very badly hit. And I also believe that women took the brunt because if they'd been at home before, or working or were furloughed or were part-time, they were more likely to lose their employment. And they also had to take primary responsibility for the education of the children that the school sent home. Now, I'm not saying all families. There were lots of families where dad and partners joined in and it was a community effort. But often it was the women that were left at home with the children. So there were all kinds of these disparities, these gaps, divides that the pandemic threw up, and not just the socioeconomic one, not just the traditional ones. And could I have then the next slide? Okay, so this brings me on the subject of women to Nigeria. Now this is very interesting, and it's important to look at the statistics and question them, because this is a chart. The blue is male, it's by percentage of respondents. The orange is female, and this is rural areas and urban areas. Now, this is asking respondents if they lost employment because of lockdowns. And this chart seems to show the opposite of what I've just told you, where I think more women lost employment. In Nigeria, less women lost employment than men. But you have to examine the kind of employment that women were doing. And women are their own bosses in part-time work, at home, in the community. And these women are therefore not going to fire themselves. So they didn't lose their employment. They might not have had any income, but they didn't lose their employment. So when you look at the statistics for lots of countries across Africa, you might see something different, but just this is a way of interpreting them. These come from the World Bank that did a COVID-19 survey. So because women are informal, self-employed workers, they're not going to fire themselves. So technically they look like they're still employed. And if we could have the next one, please. And yes, I mean, if Martin, if anybody wants to ask a question as we're going along, as opposed to the end, I don't mind stopping to answer.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. So in that sense, then, please, if you've got any question, just notify me, please, by raising your hand. Use the raise up your hand icon, the emoji, raising up your hand.
Or the chat, yeah. Yes, so what I've done here is I've told you about my background, where I'm coming from this, and I hope that these initiatives will see more of us reaching out and contacting each other and tapping each other's expertise. And I've talked about the disparities, where the gaps are, how they got worse, and where the gaps that aren't being monitored are as well, in things like access to outside space, and mental health is a big issue. I don't think enough attention is given to it. Now, what we will do now is probably have a little bit of a gap, a break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk about, to me, the biggest gap of all and the biggest opportunity of all, but also the potential crisis for Africa. And this is the issue of digital exclusion caused by many factors, but digital poverty. And coronavirus has thrown this into stark relief. Okay, I can tell you, before coronavirus, if anybody tried to FaceTime me on my phone, I was like, what? Don't I hate what I look like. Oh my God, is that your ear? Stop it, you know. So now I'm doing Zooms once or twice a week, and it's you know, I'm doing Zoom training for me. I'm giving Zoom training to others. We're having Zoom with people, but there are inequalities there as well. It's not even for everyone. So that's what I'm going to turn to after the break. What I'm trying to talk about today is how we can use this opportunity, or Africa must use this opportunity for embracing the digital, and that will impact women in particular. And I've touched on self-employed women, and I also said earlier that, you know, women are taking the brunt of this at home, and because of their employment levels and because of childcare. Okay, and what can we do? I think, Martin, you asked me what could be done differently.
Yes. That question is directly for me. So basically, I mean, here in the UK, I guess, you know, obviously we know the disparity, you know, between the employability, like, you know, the BIM community, how, you know, would I use the word, you know, detrimental the employment status of the BIM community is a fact, you see. So I guess my question to you then is there something that could have been done differently, maybe on the part of the BIM community and on the part of the government as well, to have in some way ameliorate, you know, that really glaring challenge that we face? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we would have to ask an expert in the health service, but I don't think it's the fault of the BAME community. It is a community, and I think that's the first step, that even if it's a community of your next door neighbor and two others, you know, that you reach out to each other. These disparities are here, and I'm not going to go into the political arena, which means that they are never sorted out. But my experience of many in the BAME community here is that they take education very seriously. And so, you know, the next generation, I think, the picture is looking very differently. So what you can do to ameliorate it is maybe get involved, even if it's a little thing like helping your neighbors get out, get food, not be isolated, working on local projects, to campaigning, joining some pressure group on the government. For example, I talked about the excluded. So there's a group called Excluded for the 3 million people that haven't been able to access furlough. And then all the traditional programs that are offered as solutions. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, Martin?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, it answers my question. So you know what we're going to do, Amanda? I will be reading the questions out, right? And then you'll be providing the answers. Is that okay?
That's much better. So
okay.
Shall we carry on, or shall we start with questions
yes.
already?
No, let's carry on, and then and towards the end we can start taking the questions, please. Thank you.
Okay. So we're now moving up to digital exclusion. If is it Jeff, if you wouldn't mind bringing us to the slide where we were at the break?
Yes, please. I'm working on that.
Thank you. Okay, here we are. Fantastic. So one of these gaps, Martin said, how do we ameliorate it? So now I'm talking about digital exclusion, and I talked about how hard it was for me originally to pivot to the digital. I actually have very bad eyesight, and that's one of the problems. I was in that generation where back in the 90s, I was thinking, shall I buy one of those phones and then just keep it in my handbag in case I get stuck somewhere at night and need to call someone? And so, it was looking at that technology. We didn't have the internet when I first started working. We didn't have emails. Everything was done by fax and phone. And seeing where we've come from there, so I was from the generation that was excluded really from that knowledge. I didn't grow up with it. But one thing I was impressed by when I was in Hong Kong, and this is not digital technology, but if you go to Hong Kong, every stall holder, every kiosk has a little telephone on in those days on the front of the kiosk. And you could just go and say, "Hi, can I make a call?" And all phone calls were free across the island, local numbers. And so this culture of just putting the phone out there for everybody to use. And that really is what we have to do now with the internet and 5G. We've got to make sure that phone is everywhere, every time you want to use it, not actually a telephone. So the coronavirus was an opportunity for a lot of people to meet by Facebook stream, Zoom, and digitally, but it also was a catastrophe for everybody that was excluded, either by digital poverty in their country or by personal digital poverty. So if we could have the next screen, please. Yeah. One of those communities most excluded is older people. That's me. So am I? Yeah, kind of, in a couple of years. So these are from Age UK. Now, certain parts of Africa have a much greater population in the middle. They don't have as many elder and very young, so it's a different demographic spread. But this is from the UK. So 80% of people age 65 to 74 and 44% have used the internet recently. That's the very good news. But 56% of people have not used the internet recently, and 36% are offline. So this is a concern in the UK. We have tried to keep our community together by using Zoom, but we're very aware that for some people that can cause a lot of panic and fear about how to access. And then when we're talking about the charity clients that I work with, they don't have smartphones. and they can't afford broadband. They're living in hostels. So that is a completely hopeless solution. So you have to have access to the internet, you have to have a certain economic level, you have to have devices, you have to be able to pay the broadband in order to not be digitally excluded. And then we also know that for older people, the reason they're not using the internet are these reasons that I put here: lower incomes, the older age we know, living alone, mobility challenges. So, you know, they're stuck in bed or they're stuck in one corner of the room, and they can't get out to the library to use the free computers or to an internet cafe. You know, these things are very serious barriers. And all of us here obviously don't face that barrier, and that's why we're able to speak. So one of the things we have to think about is, how are you going to contact everyone in your community that can't Zoom, or maybe doesn't want to because it's a sunny day outside today? But, you know, how do we reach out to the excluded? And other people have problems with memory or ability to concentrate, ADD, their eyes get tired, they get stressed. Technophobia, I think, isn't mentioned here. So these are very, very real challenges from the UK. But all of these challenges are nothing if your country doesn't have internet, widespread internet usage and availability, if it doesn't have the infrastructure. So if we could have the next one, please. Okay. There's a lot of text here, so you don't have to read all of it. But what I have, okay, that slide's a mistake. It should say Africa overall. No, it's Africans overall. So I've given as an example here Rwanda. Basically, and these statistics are taken from an International Monetary Fund, a report by Christina Duarte. Now, the socioeconomic divide in Africa feeds the digital divide, and the digital divide is causing more socioeconomic divide. So when you talk, and some of the questions already I saw were about how do we bridge these disparities? How do we close this gap? Well, closing the digital divide is a way to do that. So Rwanda, for example, has invested heavily in its digital infrastructure. 90% of the country has access to broadband internet. So, you know, this is an incredible statistic. 75% of the population have cell phones or smartphones. Now, how did that mean that Rwanda bridged these gaps, these bad disparities from the pandemic? Well, very quickly, Rwanda took its technical prowess and the digitalization of the whole economy and the people, their technological abilities, and it developed some very clever things. The government developed things, but there were also infotech hubs and apps and chatbots and these kind of things created by small groups. But the government itself very quickly had real-time digital mapping that allowed them to track the spread of COVID-19. And it also had telemedicine. So you didn't need to visit clinics, and it created these chatbots to update people on the pandemic, on the situation. So here in the UK, you know, we've seen how test and trace failed. And it's whether that's a government organizational failure or a technological failure. I was in a country very early in the pandemic where you could not step in or out of anywhere without putting that QR code on your phone. And if you were one of the 3 people in the country that didn't have a phone, and that country was Singapore. So Singapore was very close to China. It took it very seriously very early on. You could not go anywhere. And I'm talking about January of 2020 without signing in. And Singapore knew where you were all the time. And Singapore very quickly identified clusters and closed them down. And it knew from its cluster whether the people that had tested exactly who they'd been in touch with and whether it was a domestic cluster or whether it was somebody who'd crossed the border, who'd flown in. So the technological ability, the infrastructure, the availability of broadband and 5G was very important in managing this pandemic and coming out the other side of it. Now, if we move away from Rwanda and we look at Africans overall, the statistics are not good. I think you can see that from here. Only 28% of Africans use I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying that, this is the situation. So only 8% of Africans use the internet. And so this is a complete digital divide. It prevents the continent from taking, full advantage because technology has mitigated some of the worst effects of the pandemic. And it also, the slow spread of the internet is making obstacles and creating a divide in just, regular sustainable development. And in particular, what we're all looking at now is how do we build back? Are we coming to the end of this pandemic and how are we going to build back afterwards? So we have looked at the situation with COVID. It's made things worse for the sectors of our community that were already hardest hit by low income and by bad health outcomes. So it's made things worse for them, and it's made the socioeconomic divide more stark. And is the solution, therefore, to attack the poverty, the socioeconomic root causes? I think if you were to attack the poverty and make sure everybody had a cell phone, that's not going to help if your country hasn't got internet. So this technological exclusion and divide, this has to be dealt with systematically by governments. You can have, for example, we have a charity in Singapore that reconditions secondhand phones. And we, the memories are wiped, they're reconditioned, they're donated to us, it's all made safe, and we give them to our clients and to children. The project is to give them to children so they have tablets so they can study at home. But of course, in Singapore, you can get the internet everywhere. There's hotspots everywhere. They have 5G everywhere. There's no point me giving, having a community project to give out reconditioned tablets and tutors if that's not an online tutoring if that's not available. So can we have a look at the next slide, please? Right. So this is where I'm saying that this digital exclusion that we already have, there is this risk in Africa that it's going to turn into a catastrophe, particularly of lost education. So there might be a whole generation. We are aware, we've seen statistics that in parts of Africa, especially in the rural areas, children are just not going to school, that are being kept home, are not being educated. And they are, particularly if they have single parent families, if their mothers are already working, what they're doing is they're helping out with the employment. But they're not getting the formal education. So we're going to have this disaster of lost education. And also, it's a great opportunity to pivot to digital, and it will be a disaster if that opportunity isn't taken. So if we could have the next slide, please. Okay. So again, this has come from the IMF database and their reports. So it is the view of that author of the IMF that African policymaking focuses on reducing the socioeconomic factors, on reducing poverty. And they then take the view that, okay, that is what, that's our job. This is what development is. This is how we are Africa rising. We are attacking poverty and we've reduced poverty. And because of different economic factors and the change, you know, how the what I call a hollow GDP figure isn't enough anymore, we can see that that policy is putting the priority on the wrong areas. So development isn't, poverty reduction doesn't mean development. It doesn't equate to it. So what she says here, and I'll quote her, is paradoxically, the COVID-19 pandemic, despite all the economic and social devastation it has caused, provides an opportunity for African countries to innovate and go digital. African countries will have to rebuild their economies with digitalization leading the way. So, in other words, IMF feel, and you don't have to accept their solution or their recommendations, it's just one view, but they feel that development must be led by digitalization, and that the building back after COVID must start with digitalization, not have it as a tack on afterwards. So I hope I've shown that even here in England, our statistics for digital exclusion are very worrying. We can see also it's linked to disinformation. So even the lack of technical ability, of technological training and know-how to be able to interpret social media. So the kids that have had that training will look at a story that tells you, you know, if you cut a cucumber up in the full moon, you're not going to get the virus. They will look at that story and they will trace it. They will do a reverse Google search on the image, and they will find out where it came from. They will look for two sources, two recognized and reputable sources, and they can take something on social media and they can break it down, and they can say, you know, oh, this is nonsense, or they can say, hey, this is verified. This has an evidence, a scientific evidence base. I'm going with that. So it doesn't just have to be the fact that you've got no broadband and that you don't have access to a smartphone. It can also be the know-how and the training. So having got those skills at a very young age. And of course, having enough money. So there are families in the UK. I saw a report that interviewed parents, and there was one mother that I was particularly struck by, who said, you know, it's either pay the Wi-Fi bill this week or feed the kids. So, you know, that's what's also happened to us in the pandemic. Yeah. So if we can go to the next one. Thank you, Jeff. Yep. Is there another? Yeah. All right. So I said how the disparities, the divide from COVID showed up, you know, in stark relief, the divide that was already in society. So in Africa, we have to look at the fact that it's not just the digital side that Africans are missing. You know, hundreds of millions are left behind because there are basics, the underlying infrastructure that you need, electricity, literacy, financial inclusion. I would include social media interpretation, inclusion, and regulations. The regulatory framework of your country is very important to this. GDPR regulations, all those kinds of things, your protections of your privacy. So millions of Africans are on the wrong side of that divide. So, you know, just as they're on the wrong side of many divides that we already know about. So, you know, you're all aware of, I'm very aware of the basic health, the public necessities, the electricity, the water, the education, the healthcare. And I want you to look at the digital divide as one of those things. So we're lacking in some places education, healthcare, and water, and digital ability. So, you know, it's you've got to start adding that on. It has to be a basis. It's not some fancy icing on top of the cake. This is how we're going to move forward, all of us. If you can't get to grips with Zoom, your life is going to be completely impoverished, and you are going to fall behind. That's in England, and of course we have this situation in Africa. So especially during COVID-19, lots of public services are only accessible online. So I talked about Rwanda and how it's put its medical care, digitalized that, and it has chatbots for health. But you know, you have to be able to access that, which you can in Rwanda, but not other countries. And this comes down to African policymakers, and comes back to you as the community. So where you can make them realize that access to digital technologies is the critical tool for socioeconomic inclusion and progress, and that without that, you know, only those people with electricity and telecom services are going to benefit. Only they are going to be able to build back. And without it, this divide is going to widen. So if we even look at such things as, I'm sure a lot of you have been doing business and connecting with family back home by Zoom, and what about transmitting remittances? So you have to make sure that that the technology is there, and that policies, I know that policies are being looked at, like double tax relief. Okay, that's a policy that goes to the basic income level, but it's not a policy that will help you make your remittances faster, smoother, and you know, without the risk of fraud, with a very strong regulatory framework behind it. So these are the kind of things that you need. Yes, so Africa has a divide, digital divide. It's got a lot of divides, and I'm afraid that I have seen here in England, which is no great technological wonder, but I've seen here in England how not having access to the technology, for the reasons I've shown, has created a divide. But in Africa, I think it could be disastrous. So if we could go to the next one. Okay, so the reason I'm smiling is because, you know, I talk about these dark things, but actually it's a crisis that is an opportunity. And it's a crisis that it would be a crime if you let it go to waste. So now you have to make the most of it. So what we're seeing at the moment is small startups, small fintech hubs, small tech hubs, little groups making apps, individuals, civil society. They're embracing digital technology, but policymakers don't seem to be. So you do have this fantastic technological industry in Africa: incubators, startups, tech hubs, data centers. Now, ICT is spreading across the continent. And of course, young Africans are responding with digital technology to the challenges posed by COVID-19. So they are inventing these technological solutions, these chatbots that will give you the medical information, tracking and mapping real time where COVID is. So it's very important, therefore, as Africa rebuilds, that it must not return to the pre-pandemic reality. Okay, build back and better. I think that might be a Tory party slogan or something, but I'm not using it politically. You know, build back better, yeah, build back smarter. Don't focus on building back without the poverty, on building back and attacking the socioeconomic disparity. Focus on that digital disparity. And have a better reality that recognizes the need for innovation, particularly digital technologies, and for encouraging creativity and energy and all the amazing talent that you have. Thank you. So if we have the next one. Now, does anybody know who that gentleman in that picture is?
No.
Martin.
Is that Lee Kuan Yew?
It is. Well done.
Yes.
Well done. Okay, so the reason I'm bringing up Lee Kuan Yew is because I know that there is this lure of the strong leader, and Lee Kuan Yew wrote a book called From Third World to First World that everybody is very fond of quoting, but actually it's simply not true. So Singapore wasn't a third world in 1965 when Lee Kuan Yew became prime minister. It had been a leader in the economy of that region since the 1930s, and it's placed geographically in a center where it controls the Straits of Malacca. All shipping routes have to pass through it. What he did do was very quickly realize that he had to move to containerized ports, and Singapore already had the deepest port left to them, courtesy, along with a lot of very nasty things, courtesy of the British colonial power. So he was able to take advantage of that. But the fact that this idea it was a malarial swamp is an absolute nonsense. So that's the first thing. But he controlled all the media. So nobody's ever going to tell you he's talking nonsense except me when he was alive. The reason I brought him up as an example is one of the things we've also seen is how the pandemic can be used as an excuse for being authoritarian and taking away freedoms that you've enjoyed until now. So we all know this debate about masks. If I wear a mask, there's my personal freedom gone out the window. And we have seen, that's a debate we have in England. I'm not going to comment on that, except if you look closely, I'm rolling my eyes, because we do have a serious issue with vaccine hesitancy, and that's a group that can be persuaded to take the vaccine and currently aren't. And England has taken quite a laid back approach, but it has also used the pandemic as an excuse to evade democracy, from very limited attendance in the House of Commons to pushing through bills without going through Parliament, to bringing up anti-protest laws. And we saw some very heavy-handed policing very early on, which was then turned over when it was examined. But we've seen other countries, China, when it first started, literally locking people into apartment blocks by nailing the windows shut. And if anybody has seen any of the news about British people being expelled from Singapore for not wearing masks. So Singapore started with quite a laid back approach. It hadn't quite understood. It thought it was a Chinese problem. Singapore blocked the borders to China very, very early. And then it realized this was not SARS, because SARS killed about 40 to 50% of people that caught it. So SARS killed itself out very quickly. There were no hosts for the virus. When it realized that this is not SARS, it started very, very serious lockdowns. If you don't wear a mask on the tube in Singapore, you are going to get arrested. And there are ambassadors everywhere to check you do. You're not even allowed to talk on public transport in Singapore. You're not allowed to talk on the bus or the tube. Now, in case you take your mask off to do it, or you shout and the aerosols come out of your temporary mask. So there are some very, very strict laws. And look at Singapore's death toll. Okay, it's a tiny island. It's about 6 million people. The death toll so far, and it's next door to China, is about 36. Or it could be 48, but that's the total death toll. And when I say to my Singaporean friends, oh, it's really good, we've only had 130 deaths this week, that they almost faint. What do you mean this week? So there is an approach. They have identity cards for every single person. They know where you are all of the time. You have to check in. They have police and people with special powers. They arrest you, they deport you, and there is a temptation to look at that and say, well, this is the solution. You know, Singapore, I have to tell you, is not a democracy. And so it holds elections, but it's not a democracy. The government owns all of the land. The government owns all of the media, and it controls social media through very strict rules. And there is a handful of people in the opposition, but they are kind of token opposition. It's not actual opposition. And some years the government has won the general election before it started, because there aren't enough opposition candidates. So it's not there aren't any free and independent judges. They're selected by the president or the prime minister, and so on and so forth. It's not a democracy. So what I want to just say, that while we are trying to build back from the pandemic, let's be aware that some of these solutions are very illiberal. Possibly, you know, identity, tracking people, keeping data on people, locking people up, you know, and particularly Parliament not having the same scrutiny as we're used to giving it. So let's not say, you know, let's not say we'll excuse authoritarianism, we'll excuse dictatorship if it's benign. Let's just be aware of the dangers of that, and let's build back in a way that maintains all the freedom that digital technology gives us, and doesn't bring with it all the downside of authoritarianism. So, and I think that more or less brings me to a close. I've got my last slide here, which I think, yeah, there we go. Oh, never mind. So the last slide is just a pretty picture of Africa digitalized, just to let you know where I'm coming from. Okay, so thank you very much, Martin. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That was really insightful. Quite conscious of time now. So what I'm going to do is I would allow you to take, because we started pretty some few minutes late. So I would allow you to take 2 questions from the questions we've got on the chat box. Okay, if that's okay, Amanda. Before we close, okay?
Yes, I may not be able to answer them, but yes.
Okay, right. Okay, I'm going to go for the really easy one then. So there's one from Anna, and it reads, how do we differentiate the disparities caused by Brexit and COVID-19?
Very interesting question. I think Brexit has thrown up the same disparities that we had before. Personally, I feel that there's been an overemphasis on, you know, I have a second home in Ile-de-Ré, and now I can't go there back and forth to my second home. But, you know, most of us live in the Isle of Dogs, and that's not relevant. So the disparities from Brexit has made the disparities worse, but we also have these opportunities like the visas for Kenyan nurses. So we have this new program now, which is pretty amazing, and that's unemployed but qualified Kenyan nurses are going to get visas to come here. Now, it's not the work visa that matters. It's not freedom of movement that matters. It's the fact that those nurses will then go back to Kenya with the information and the experience. Hopefully, they'll teach us here a lot as well, but they will go back with that medical knowledge, and that is a wonderful exchange. I think if I'd been negotiating the policy, I would have asked our government to put into that an arrangement, this is very sad, for nurses that die. It's very well getting a visa for a Kenyan nurse to come here, but what about the nurse from Uganda that's died here? And she's died here because she's working on a COVID ward. How do you repatriate the body, and who should pay for that? I would have added that into the policy to make that more even. But certainly, yeah, Brexit, the government is trying to hide the damage from Brexit and blame COVID for it in a lot of areas. And that's why I said we must be very careful that we still keep scrutinizing our government and not allow it to make decisions through people like Dominic Cummings. You know, we have to make sure that everything goes through Parliament and we uphold our parliamentary democracy, so they don't get away with it, basically. Thank you, Anna. Lovely question.
Thank you, Amanda. Anna, have you got any other question you want to ask verbally?
Yes. Hi, Amanda. Hi. Thank you. It was a brilliant one. I really did enjoy it. Before Martins asks the second one, I just wanted to find out, how do we, as a charity organization, NDPID, how do we help? How do we come in to bridge the disparity created by this COVID-19?
So I think that, you know, in the way that all charities do, I think you can have surveys amongst your members, and you can produce research, and you can use that to feed into policy making, because you have this unique talent pool. So you can, amongst your fantastic community, I think you need to start from that basis of surveying and giving those results to the policy makers, so that, and maybe feeding in partnership with other charities, passing it up to the big charities that have clout to get your voice heard, and also tap on your talent for the, as I've said, you know, these smaller local community things like reconditioning tablets for the community use, or having a phone bank to phone around isolated members. Those are all brilliant things, but what you really want to be doing now is pushing policymakers.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Anna, does that answer your question then? So
yes, it does, and Amanda will be keeping in touch afterwards, because I know you're good with it.
Yeah, everybody can contact me. Juliet is a good friend, and I thank you once again, Anna and Martin, Jeff. Thank you for that. Thank you for everybody who organised this. It's a very impressive initiative and charity, and I look forward to speaking to any of you that I can help, or you can help me.